Hey, I'm Tyler. This is my first laptop, a 2008 white MacBook. Starting off, I should mention that this computer was originally my mom's, and then when she got a 2015 MacBook Pro in, 2015, she gave me this one. So it was mine for a few years, and it's in decent condition. Personally, I have tried to keep it as close to perfect as I can. However, the fact that it already had some flaws before I got it to it makes it obviously pretty hard to keep in perfect condition. Apparently it's a very common flaw with these, but the bottom case is cracked where the bumpers from the lid close onto it. I don't know when that happened because I don't think it was always like that, but that's just something that happens very frequently with these. Another thing is that the battery is completely dead. So if I were to say unplug it like this, it's gone because the battery just doesn't work at all. Sometimes it doesn't think it has a battery in, and sometimes it just says replace now and isn't charging. It is the last of these early polycarbonate MacBooks. Yeah, they did keep doing them, but they changed the design up a bit. So this is one of the very last. It's got a Core 2 Duo inside as well as 4 gigabytes of RAM. And in terms of power, it's not very much. At this point, this computer is 17 years old, and power isn't really much of a factor as much as software is. So in terms of software, this computer has macOS 10.6 Snow Leopard, which came out in 2009 and wasn't the original software this computer could run, believe it or not. It could only run down to Leopard and up to Lion. So that's only 3 major macOS versions, but that was over a span of 4 years. So kind of similar to modern Macs, just they didn't do as many software updates back then. In terms of built-in software, it has way less than a current Mac. You don't get Pages, Keynote, or Numbers for free. Those were paid in a suite called iWork. When you bought a Mac, it would come pre-installed with iLife, though, which was a suite containing GarageBand, iMovie, iWeb, and iPhoto. The last two don't exist anymore because you don't need them. iWeb is just completely gone. There's no alternative. Building a website nowadays, for most people, isn't as interesting as it was back in the late 2000s. Most people just have social media, Twitter, Facebook, whatever else. So people aren't building websites anymore. However, iPhoto is kind of a little more interesting. iPhoto was essentially the predecessor to the current macOS Photos app. It had a completely different UI, and all of the organizational features were very different. And in some ways, I kind of prefer them. Having events and albums separately is really nice. There are technically still events in Apple Photos. However, they're auto-categorized by date, and you can't give them custom names. So having the ability to differentiate between events and albums, it was really cool. There are a couple other Apple apps back then that don't exist anymore. One of the notable ones was Aperture. So iPhoto and Aperture were both photo apps. However, now they've just been merged into Photos. One of the things I remember most about this MacBook was iTunes. I used iTunes 11, which came out around the time of macOS Mavericks in 2013. It was completely different than any iTunes version before it, and pretty different from anything after it. It was the last skeuomorphic release of iTunes before they switched to the flat design of iTunes 12 and later. On Snow Leopard, iTunes 11.4 was the newest version of iTunes you could download, and I think it's the best version of iTunes. I love the design. The albums view, in my opinion, is amazing. The colored backgrounds that match the album art, it just looks amazing. Everything is sorted really nicely in my opinion, and I just think that it works really well. Up until a few months ago, I even used this MacBook still with iTunes for my iPod collection because it's a lot easier to sync them to an older Mac than a new one. I have issues with my current MacBook all the time. But regardless, iTunes 11 worked great for that. And it was really nice having such a beautifully designed program running on a beautifully designed laptop with some iPods. The one last program that I'm going to cover on here is more of a set of programs, and it will be Office 2008. Now, when I used this computer 10 years ago, I didn't have the know-how to download things, and I barely knew how to navigate the internet. But my mom did. It was hers before me, so she had Microsoft Office pre-installed for me. I was still really young, but I was in my little creative phase, as most people go through. So I wrote a lot of books about cars and things of the sort in Microsoft Word 2008. And I have some really fond memories of those apps. I don't use Office anymore today. I very rarely use those sorts of apps in the first place. And if I do, I just use Apple Pages because it's the most native Mac OS thing and it's not paid. However, Microsoft Office 2008 has a sweet spot in my heart because of this. Alright, enough talk about software. Let's discuss the hardware of this fine laptop. Unlike the later unibody MacBooks, this one's built out of many pieces of white plastic. And it's not bad quality plastic by any means, but it hasn't held up the best. In some spots, like the keyboard especially, it's very discolored, the touchpad a little bit as well, and there are cracks in the top case like I've already mentioned. But otherwise, it's in great condition, I would say. It's still mostly shiny white on the outside, and that is partially thanks to a clear protective layer that we had on it for a long time. But, I mean, it's pretty great. I am just now noticing a crack in the corner, which I never saw before. But otherwise, I think it still holds up pretty well. And even though I would never think it's a modern design today, I think it still holds up pretty nicely. There are a lot of clear ways that we've advanced in laptop hardware since this computer. One very clear example is the display. The viewing angles suck. There's nothing else I can really say to it. They're bad. They're terrible. If it's only slightly off, it's either very bright or very dim. And I feel like at that point, they couldn't do much about it. Laptop displays were still very quickly advancing, but it's just not great today. The touchpad is yet another thing that doesn't hold up, and especially compared to current Macs. It's plastic with one button on the bottom, and it's not as bad as other plastic touchpads that I've used, especially that Windows Vista laptop I took a look at in the last video, but it's nowhere near the quality of current glass Apple touchpads, especially the ones with Force Touch. One thing that does hold up really well is the keyboard. That's not really surprising because good keyboards don't spontaneously get worse as time goes on, but it does type really nicely, and it's similar to the wireless keyboards from the late 2000s, early 2010s, if you've ever used that. I personally don't think it's as good as current Apple laptop keyboards like my 2021 MacBook Pro, but it's not an unpleasant experience, to say the least. Speaking of my 2021 MacBook Pro, here it is. As you can tell, they're very close in size, which I never really compared them before recording for this video, so seeing how similar they are, it's really interesting. Obviously their proportions aren't the same, but the new MacBook Pro has a much bigger screen and a thinner one at that. Again, that's one of the downsides of this older MacBook being the screen. Now, yes, a more fair comparison would probably be a unibody MacBook Pro from 2008 to my current MacBook, but this isn't just a old MacBook to new MacBook comparison, it's my old MacBook to my new MacBook. So I think it's neat seeing how far I've come, really. One of the things I find most interesting about computers lately is that I feel like they haven't physically changed that much in the last decade or so. Like I said, these are 13 years apart in physical age. If I were to find a laptop from 13 years before this one, the difference between those two would be massive. However, the difference between these two isn't really. I mean, obviously, we know what's different, and we know how much more powerful and capable this one is, but just from looking at it, they're very close. The layout is all there. So, I wonder how far computers are going to go in the next 13 years. Each of these have had very different use cases for me. When I used this 2008 MacBook. It was mostly for whatever web browsing and word processing that a 6-year-old would do. I don't really remember. And I would listen to music through iTunes. But this 2021 MacBook Pro has had a much different use for me, as I've used it to edit every single video on the channel, and I've also used it for schoolwork. But it's gotten a lot more use, a lot more heavy use than the 2008. One day I'm probably going to do a much more in-depth look at this 2008 MacBook. I might upgrade it at some point, since as far as I know, it still hasn't been upgraded. It still has the same 160 gigabyte hard drive from back in 2008. But I hope this has been a nice short look at the difference in my first and current laptops. So that's going to be all. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you'd like to see more like this. And I'll see you in the next video.